What would you do if the person you love most in the world, the child you gave everything for, abandoned you in your most vulnerable moment? Hello my dear friends, if this story touches your heart, please hit that like button and subscribe to our channel because today I need to share something that happened to me, something that changed my life forever. My name is Margaret, I am 67 years old, and I live alone in Phoenix, Arizona since my husband Robert passed away 3 years ago. I thought I knew what heartbreak was when I lost my husband, but nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what my own son would do to me. If you are over 60 like me, if you have sacrificed everything for your children, this story will hit you right in the heart. So please stay with me until the end because what happened next will shock you. I raised my son Michael as a single mother after his father left us when he was just 5 years old. I worked 2 jobs, cleaned offices at night and worked at a grocery store during the day, just to give him everything he needed. I never remarried, never put any man before my child. Every dollar I earned went to his education, his clothes, his dreams. When he graduated college, I was so proud, so happy that all my sacrifices had paid off. He met Sarah, a lovely girl from a good family, and they got married last year in a beautiful ceremony that I helped pay for. I thought finally I would have the family I always dreamed of. My son lived just 20 minutes away from me in Tempe, and for a while, things seemed perfect. He would call me twice a week, visit me on Sundays, and Sarah would bring me homemade cookies and tell me stories about her job as a teacher. I felt like the luckiest mother in the world. I had my boy, and now I had a daughter too. Sarah would sit with me in my kitchen and we would talk about recipes, about her students, about their plans for the future. Michael would fix little things around my house, change light bulbs, check my car, just like his father used to do. During those months, I felt complete again. The emptiness that Robert's death had left in my heart was slowly being filled by the warmth of having my family close. I would go to bed every night thanking God for giving me such a wonderful son and such a caring daughter-in-law. I even started thinking that maybe, just maybe, I would have grandchildren soon, and my little house would be filled with laughter and tiny footsteps again. But something started changing after they came back from their honeymoon. The calls became once a week, then once every 2 weeks. The Sunday visits became monthly, then almost never. When I asked Michael about it, he would say he was busy with work, busy with his new life, busy building his future with Sarah. I understood, or at least I tried to understand. Young people have their own lives, their own priorities, their own dreams to chase. I did not want to be that clingy mother who suffocates her children with too much attention. So I smiled, I nodded, and I told myself that this was normal, this was how things were supposed to be when children grow up and start their own families. But deep in my heart, something felt wrong, something felt different about my son. The way he looked at me had changed. When he did visit, he seemed impatient, always checking his phone, always talking about places he wanted to go with Sarah, things they wanted to buy, trips they were planning. He never asked me how I was feeling, never noticed that I had lost weight, never saw that I was struggling to keep up with the house maintenance by myself. When I would try to tell him about my week, about the neighbors, about small things that mattered to me, his eyes would glaze over and he would change the subject to something about his work or his friends. It was like I had become invisible to him, like I was just an obligation he had to check off his list every few weeks. Sarah started coming less and less too. When I asked Michael about her, he would say she was tired from work, or that she had plans with her own family, or that she was not feeling well. I started to suspect that maybe Sarah did not really like me as much as I thought. Maybe I had been too eager, too welcoming, maybe I had overwhelmed her with my affection. I began to second-guess every conversation we had had, every hug I had given her, every piece of advice I had offered. Maybe I was just a lonely old woman who had misread kindness for genuine love. The doubt ate at me during those long, quiet evenings when my phone never rang and my doorbell never chimed. The pain in my stomach started 6 months ago, right around the time when Michael's visits became rare and Sarah disappeared completely from my life. At first, I thought it was just stress, just the loneliness eating away at me from the inside. I had read somewhere that emotional pain can manifest as physical pain, and I convinced myself that if I just stayed busy, if I just stopped feeling sorry for myself, the pain would go away. I started volunteering at the local library, helping elderly people learn how to use computers. I joined a book club at the community center. I even signed up for a cooking class, thinking that maybe if I learned new recipes, I could invite Michael and Sarah over for dinner and win them back with delicious food. But the pain got worse, much worse. I could barely eat, could barely sleep. Even simple tasks like grocery shopping became exhausting. I would find myself doubled over in the cereal aisle, clutching my stomach and trying not to cry in public. My neighbor, Mrs. Rodriguez, noticed that I was not taking care of my garden anymore and came over to check on me. When she saw how pale and thin I had become, she insisted on driving me to the doctor. I was embarrassed and tried to refuse, but she would not take no for an answer. That day, sitting in Dr. Martinez's office, I realized how alone I had become. Here was a neighbor I barely knew showing more concern for my health than my own son. Dr. Martinez ran several tests and the results were not good. My gallbladder was severely infected and needed to be removed immediately. He explained that if I waited any longer, the infection could spread and become life-threatening. He scheduled my surgery for the following week and gave me a list of things I needed to arrange before the procedure. The most important thing on that list was having someone to drive me to the hospital, stay with me during the surgery, and help me recover at home for the first few days. As I sat in my car outside the doctor's office, staring at that list, I realized I had only one person to call. My son Michael. When I called Michael to tell him the news, he sounded genuinely concerned for the first time in months. His voice changed, became softer, more caring, more like the little boy who used to crawl into my bed during thunderstorms. He asked me questions about the surgery, about the recovery time, about what the doctor had said. He sounded worried, he sounded scared, and for a moment, I felt like I had my son back. He said he would take care of everything, that I should not worry about anything, that he would be there for me every step of the way. He promised he would drive me to the hospital, stay with me during the surgery, and help me recover at home. He even said Sarah was planning to take time off work to help take care of me. For the first time in months, I felt hope flooding my heart. My son still loved me, he still cared about me, and when I really needed him, he would be there. I went to bed that night feeling grateful, feeling blessed, feeling like everything was going to be okay. I even called Mrs. Rodriguez to tell her that my son was coming to help, and I could hear the relief in her voice too. She had been worried about me, she said, and she was so happy that my family was going to be there for me. I spent the week before my surgery cleaning my house, buying groceries that Michael liked, and preparing everything for his visit. I wanted everything to be perfect when he came to take care of his mother. The night before my surgery, Michael came over with Sarah, and I felt like my prayers had been answered. They brought me beautiful flowers, yellow roses that reminded me of the ones Robert used to give me, and they said all the right things. Michael held my hand and looked me straight in the eyes with that same earnest expression he had as a child when he promised to clean his room or do his homework. He said, "Mom, do not worry about anything. I will be right there with you tomorrow. I am not going anywhere. I promise you, I will take care of everything." Sarah nodded and smiled, her hand on my shoulder, saying she had already arranged to take several days off work to help take care of me after the surgery. I hugged them both, tears streaming down my face, not from fear of the surgery anymore, but from pure joy. My son was going to be there for me, just like I had always been there for him. All those nights I stayed up when he was sick, all those times I drove him to practice or games or school events, all those sacrifices I made were finally going to be returned. This was what family meant. This was what love looked like. This was the bond between a mother and her child that nothing could break. That night, I packed my hospital bag with such hope in my heart. I even packed an extra nightgown because I thought Sarah might want to stay over and help me when I got home from the hospital. But the first crack in my heart came the very next morning, the morning of my surgery. I woke up at 5 in the morning, nervous but ready, my hospital bag packed and sitting by the front door. My surgery was scheduled for 9, and Michael had promised to pick me up at 7:30 to make sure we had plenty of time to get to the hospital and complete all the paperwork. I had my insurance cards ready, my identification, everything organized in a small purse that I could easily carry. I made myself a light breakfast, took a shower, and put on comfortable clothes just like the nurse had instructed. I was ready, I was prepared, and I was counting on my son. 7:30 came and went. No knock on the door, no phone call, no Michael. I checked my phone to make sure it was working, checked the time to make sure I had not made a mistake. 8 o'clock arrived, still no Michael. I started to feel that familiar knot in my stomach, but I told myself there was probably traffic, probably some delay, probably a reasonable explanation. I called his phone, and it went straight to voicemail. I hung up and called again immediately. Still voicemail. I waited 5 minutes and called again. Voicemail. By 8:15, I was pacing around my living room, my heart racing, my mind spinning with worry and confusion. At 8:30, just 30 minutes before I was supposed to be at the hospital, I called again. Voicemail. I called Sarah's phone. Voicemail. I was starting to panic now, not about the surgery, but about being abandoned by the people I trusted most. Finally, at 8:45, just 15 minutes before I needed to be at the hospital for the most important surgery of my life, Michael called me back. But his voice sounded different, distant, almost annoyed, like I was interrupting something important. He said there had been an emergency at work, something urgent that he could not get out of, some crisis with a client that required his immediate attention. My heart sank, but I tried to understand. Emergencies happen, work is important, especially for young people trying to build their careers. He said Sarah would drive me to the hospital instead, that she was getting ready and would be there soon. I felt disappointed but not devastated yet. At least Sarah was coming, at least I would not be completely alone. But minutes ticked by, and Sarah never called, never showed up, never sent a message. At 9:15, 15 minutes after I was supposed to be in surgery, with my stomach cramping from stress and my hands shaking from betrayal, I called a taxi and went to the hospital alone. As I sat in that taxi, watching the familiar streets of Phoenix pass by through the window, I felt something inside me breaking. This was my son, the little boy I had raised by myself, the child I had given everything for, and he had left me to face surgery alone. But even then, even as the taxi pulled up to the hospital and I walked through those doors by myself carrying my own bag, I still hoped. I still believed that there was a good reason, that he would show up, that this was all just a terrible misunderstanding that we would laugh about later. I had no idea that this was just the beginning of the most painful lesson of my life. I went into surgery completely alone, something I never imagined would happen to me in my entire life. The nurses were kind and professional, they held my hand and told me everything would be fine, but it was not the same as having your family there, having someone who truly loves you waiting for you to wake up. As they put the mask over my face and told me to count backwards from 10, the last thought in my mind was hoping that Michael would be there when I woke up, that there was a reasonable explanation for why he had not shown up, that this was all just a terrible misunderstanding that we would laugh about later. I kept telling myself that he would walk into my recovery room with flowers and apologies, that maybe his work emergency was real, that maybe something had happened to Sarah that prevented her from coming. But when I opened my eyes 4 hours later, groggy and in pain from the surgery, the first thing I saw was an empty chair next to my bed. No Michael, no Sarah, no flowers, no apologies, no explanations. Just me and the steady beeping of the machines keeping track of my heart rate and blood pressure. The recovery room was cold and sterile, and I felt more alone than I had ever felt in my entire life, even more alone than when Robert died, because at least then Michael had been there to hold my hand and cry with me. Now, in my moment of greatest vulnerability, when I needed my family the most, there was nobody. The nurse, a sweet woman named Patricia who had kind eyes and gray hair like mine, came over to check on me. She asked me if I needed anything, if I was in pain, if there was someone she could call for me. When I told her my son was supposed to be there but had not shown up, I saw something change in her expression, a look I would see many times over the next few days. Patricia had worked in that hospital for 25 years, she told me later, and she had seen this story more times than she cared to count. Children who promise to be there for their parents and then disappear when it really matters. She did not say this to me right away, of course, because she was professional and kind, but I could see it in her eyes. She had dealt with abandoned elderly parents before, and she knew exactly what I was going through. She adjusted my pillows, checked my and told me that the surgery had gone perfectly, that Dr. Martinez was very pleased with how everything had turned out. But even as she spoke about my physical recovery, I could tell she was worried about my emotional state, about the fact that I was facing this alone. The hours passed slowly in that recovery room. Other patients had visitors coming and going, bringing flowers and balloons, sitting beside their beds and talking quietly. I watched families reunite, watched grown children fuss over their parents, watched spouses hold hands and share quiet conversations. Every time the door opened, my heart would jump, thinking maybe, just maybe, Michael had finally come. But it was always someone else's family, always someone else's happy reunion, never mine. I called his phone several times, but it kept going to voicemail. I called Sarah too, same thing. By evening, when visiting hours were almost over, I had to accept the horrible truth that my son was not coming, that whatever was more important to him than his mother's surgery was still keeping him away. That night, alone in my hospital room, I could not sleep despite the pain medication they gave me. I kept thinking about all the times Michael had been sick as a child, all the nights I had stayed awake watching over him, taking his temperature, making sure he was breathing okay when he had pneumonia at age 8. I remembered sitting in hospital waiting rooms when he broke his arm playing soccer, when he had his appendix removed at 15, when he got food poisoning from a restaurant and needed 4 fluids. I was always there, always worried, always making sure he had everything he needed. I had never once considered not being there for him, had never once put anything else before his health and well-being. Yet here I was, recovering from surgery, and he could not even make a phone call to check on me. The next morning brought the second devastating blow. Patricia came in early to check on me and prepare me for discharge. She explained that I needed to arrange transportation home and that I should have someone stay with me for at least the first 24 hours in case there were any complications. When I told her I would call my son, she gave me that same look again, that mixture of pity and understanding that I was beginning to recognize. I called Michael's phone, and this time he actually answered. His voice sounded relaxed, happy even, completely different from the stressed emergency tone he had used yesterday morning. When I told him I was being discharged and needed someone to pick me up, there was a long pause on the other end. Then came the excuse that shattered my heart into a million pieces. Michael told me he was sorry, but he and Sarah had decided to take a last-minute trip out of town, something about a great deal they found on a vacation package that they could not pass up. He said they had left Phoenix early that morning and were already at the airport. He suggested I call a taxi or maybe ask one of my neighbors to help me. The casual way he said it, like he was talking about the weather or what he had for breakfast, made me feel sick to my stomach. This was my son, my only child, the person I had sacrificed everything for, and he was telling me to call a taxi to take me home from surgery because he had decided to go on vacation instead. I asked him why he had not told me about this trip before my surgery, why he had promised to take care of me if he knew he was going to be out of town. His answer was even worse than his original excuse. He said the trip had been a surprise from Sarah, something she had planned to cheer him up because he had been stressed about work lately. He said they deserved some time together, some fun after dealing with all the pressure and responsibility he had been under. Not once did he ask how the surgery had gone, not once did he ask if I was okay, not once did he apologize for leaving me alone. It was all about him, about his stress, about his need for fun and relaxation. I was just an inconvenience, just another source of stress that he needed to escape from. When I hung up the phone, Patricia was standing nearby, and she had heard enough of the conversation to understand what had happened. Without saying a word, she sat down next to my bed and held my hand while I cried. She told me that her own mother had gone through something similar with her brother, that unfortunately this kind of selfishness was more common than people wanted to admit. She helped me arrange for a medical transport van to take me home, something I had to pay for myself even though I was on a fixed income and money was always tight. As we waited for the van to arrive, Patricia gave me her personal phone number and made me promise to call if I had any complications or if I needed anything at all. A stranger, a nurse who barely knew me, was showing more care and concern than my own flesh and blood. The ride home in that medical van was one of the loneliest experiences of my life. The driver was kind and careful, but he was just doing his job, just another professional being paid to take care of what my family should have been doing for free out of love. As we pulled into my driveway, I realized that I was going to have to recover from major surgery completely by myself. No one to help me up the stairs, no one to make sure I was eating properly, no one to notice if something went wrong. The house felt cold and empty when I walked in, still wearing the same clothes I had put on 2 days earlier when I thought my son was coming to pick me up. That evening, as I struggled to open a can of soup with my tender incision site, my phone rang. For a moment, my heart leaped, thinking maybe Michael had come to his senses. Maybe he was calling to check on me or to tell me he was coming home early from his trip. But it was Mrs. Rodriguez, my neighbor, who had noticed the medical van and wanted to make sure I was okay. When I told her what had happened, the anger in her voice was immediate and fierce. She said she would be right over with dinner and that I should not even think about taking care of myself until I was fully healed. Within an hour, she was at my door with homemade chicken soup, fresh bread, and a determination to help that put my own son to shame. Over the next few days, it was Mrs. Rodriguez who checked on me every morning and evening. It was she who drove me to my follow-up appointment with Dr. Martinez. It was she who sat with me when the pain was bad and I was scared that something might be wrong. She even brought her daughter Maria over to help with my laundry and light housework. These people who owed me nothing, who barely knew me beyond casual conversations over the fence, were treating me with more love and respect than my own child. The irony was not lost on me, and it made Michael's absence even more painful and inexcusable. But the worst revelation was yet to come. 3 days after my surgery, while I was still in considerable pain and barely able to move around my house without help, I decided to check social media on my tablet. I rarely used Facebook, but Patricia had mentioned that sometimes seeing pictures of happy families helped her patients feel less alone. What I found instead nearly sent me back to the hospital. There, on Michael's Facebook page, were dozens of photos from Hawaii. Pictures of him and Sarah on the beach, at fancy restaurants, swimming with dolphins, hiking to waterfalls. The photos were dated the same day as my surgery, the same day he had told me there was a work emergency. The photos showed them laughing, holding tropical drinks, celebrating what looked like the vacation of a lifetime. In one photo, Michael was holding a sign that said, "Best husband ever," that Sarah had apparently bought him at a gift shop. In another, they were dressed up for what looked like an expensive dinner at a resort restaurant. These were not the photos of people dealing with a work emergency or a last-minute trip. These were photos of a planned, elaborate, expensive vacation that had been booked and paid for long before my surgery date. My son had looked me in the eye the night before my operation, had held my hand and promised to be there for me, knowing full well that he was going to be on a beach in Hawaii instead. But what hurt even more than the lies were the comments from their friends. Person after person congratulating them on their beautiful trip, saying they deserved this time together, asking about the resort and the activities. Sarah had posted about the spa treatments she was getting, the shopping she was doing, the romantic dinners they were sharing. Not one single mention of a sick mother back home, not one acknowledgement that maybe this was not the best time for a vacation. It was like I did not exist, like the woman who had raised Michael and helped pay for their wedding was completely invisible to them and to their friends. The final blow came when I read a comment thread between Sarah and one of her girlfriends. The friend had asked why they had decided to go to Hawaii now, and Sarah's response made my blood run cold. She wrote that they had been planning this trip for months but had to keep it secret because Michael's mom has been really needy lately and would have tried to guilt us into staying home if she knew we were going away. She went on to say that they had earned this vacation, and that they refused to let family drama ruin their happiness. Family drama. That is what my surgery was to her, what my need for help and support was to my son's wife. Just drama to be avoided, just an inconvenience to be escaped from. As I sat there in my living room, still in my pajamas because getting dressed was too painful, reading about how my need for my son's love and support was considered family drama, something inside me changed forever. This was not just about a missed visit or a forgotten promise. This was about who my son had become, about the values he had chosen, about the kind of man he had decided to be. And if this story is touching your heart, if you understand the pain of being forgotten by the people you love most, please take a moment to like this video and share it with others who might need to hear they are not alone in this struggle. The worst part was not over yet. And what happened next would test everything I thought I knew about love, family, and forgiveness. The days that followed my discovery of those Hawaii photos were the darkest of my entire life. Darker even than when Robert died, because at least then I had Michael to lean on, to grieve with, to help me figure out how to move forward. Now I was not just dealing with physical pain from the surgery, I was dealing with the emotional devastation of realizing that my only child, the person I had devoted my entire adult life to raising and loving, saw me as nothing more than an inconvenience to be avoided. Every morning when I woke up, for just a split second I would forget what had happened, and then the reality would crash over me like a cold wave. My son had abandoned me during surgery to go on vacation, and he had lied to my face about it. Mrs. Rodriguez continued to check on me every day, bringing me meals and helping with tasks that were too difficult for me to manage alone. Her kindness was a blessing, but it also made Michael's absence more painful because it showed me what real caring looked like. Here was a woman who barely knew me, who had her own family and her own problems, yet she made time every single day to make sure I was okay. Meanwhile, my own son had not called once since that conversation from the airport, had not sent a single text message to ask how I was healing, had not shown even the smallest bit of concern for my well-being. The contrast was heartbreaking and humiliating. On my 6th day home from the hospital, I started having complications that scared me more than the original surgery had. My incision site became red and swollen, and I developed a fever that made me feel weak and confused. Dr. Martinez had told me to watch for signs of infection and to call immediately if anything seemed wrong. But when I called his office, they said he was fully booked and suggested I go to the emergency room if I was really concerned. The thought of going back to that hospital alone, of sitting in the emergency room by myself while feeling sick and scared, was almost more than I could bear. But I knew I had no choice, and I knew exactly who I could not count on for help. I called Mrs. Rodriguez, and within 15 minutes she was at my door with her car keys in her hand. She took one look at me and said we were going to the hospital immediately, no discussion, no questions asked. As she helped me into her car, I found myself crying again, not from physical pain this time, but from the overwhelming gratitude I felt toward this woman who was treating me better than my own flesh and blood. During the drive to the hospital, I told her about the Facebook photos, about the lies Michael had told me, about how he and Sarah had called my surgery family drama that they needed to escape from. Mrs. Rodriguez was so angry she had to pull over for a moment to compose herself. She said something that day that I will never forget as long as I live. She said, "Margaret, I have 4 children, and if any one of them treated me the way your son has treated you, I would be ashamed that I had failed as a mother. But you did not fail. You raised a selfish, ungrateful man. But that is his choice, not your fault. You gave him everything, and now he owes you basic human decency, and he is choosing not to pay that debt. That says everything about him and nothing about you." Her words gave me a kind of strength I had not felt since this whole ordeal began, a reminder that I had value and worth regardless of how my son chose to treat me. At the emergency room, they confirmed that I had developed a minor infection at the incision site. Nothing life-threatening but something that needed immediate treatment with antibiotics. The doctor, a young woman about Sarah's age, asked me if I had someone at home who could monitor me and make sure I was taking the medication properly. When I hesitated, Mrs. Rodriguez spoke up and said she would be checking on me every few hours until I was better. The doctor smiled and said I was lucky to have such a caring daughter, and neither Mrs. Rodriguez nor I bothered to correct her. It felt good to have someone assume I was loved and cared for, even if the person doing the caring was not actually related to me. The infection took another week to clear up completely, and during that entire time, Michael never called. I knew he was back from Hawaii because he had posted more photos on Facebook, pictures of them unpacking souvenirs and talking about what a wonderful, relaxing time they had had. He was back to his normal routine, back to work, back to his regular life, and apparently back to completely forgetting that his mother existed. I kept waiting for him to call, kept expecting that surely once he was home and settled, he would remember that I had had surgery, that I might need some help, that a good son would at least check in. But my phone remained silent. 3 weeks after my surgery, I made a decision that surprised even me. I called Michael's office number, the direct line he had given me years ago for emergencies only. When his secretary answered, I told her I was his mother and that I needed to speak with him about a family matter. She put me through immediately, and when Michael answered the phone, he sounded annoyed and rushed, like I was interrupting something important. I told him about the infection, about the emergency room visit, about how scared I had been. His response was brief and cold. He said he was glad I was feeling better now, but he was in the middle of an important meeting and could not talk long. He did not ask for details about what had happened, did not apologize for not being there, did not even ask who had helped me when I needed to go to the hospital. When I mentioned that Mrs. Rodriguez had been taking care of me, that a neighbor I barely knew had shown more concern for my well-being than he had, Michael got defensive. He said he had been busy with work, that he assumed I was fine since I had not called him, that he could not be expected to read my mind about what I needed. The blame shifting, the complete lack of accountability, the way he made everything my fault for not asking for help from the son who had abandoned me, made me angrier than I had ever been in my entire life. But what came next in that phone conversation would reveal a truth so ugly, so devastating, that it would change everything between us forever. I asked him directly why he had lied to me about the Hawaii trip, why he had told me it was a work emergency when he had clearly been planning this vacation for a long time. There was a long silence on the other end of the phone, and then Michael said something that cut me deeper than any surgical knife ever could. He said that he and Sarah had needed that vacation, that they had been looking forward to it for months, and that my surgery was unfortunately timed, but not something that should have ruined their plans. He said that Sarah had already arranged time off work, that they had already paid for the trip, and that it would not have made sense to cancel everything just because I needed a simple outpatient procedure. A simple outpatient procedure. That is how my son described surgery that could have been life-threatening if complications had developed, surgery that left me alone and vulnerable and in need of help. But even worse was what he said next. He told me that Sarah had been concerned about how dependent I had become on them since Robert died, how I seemed to expect them to drop everything whenever I had a problem. He said they had decided as a couple that they needed to establish healthy boundaries with me, and that meant not letting my medical issues interfere with their personal plans. Healthy boundaries. That is what he called abandoning his mother during surgery and lying about it afterward. The conversation ended when Michael said he really had to get back to his meeting, that we could discuss this further some other time when he was not so busy. He hung up without saying goodbye, without saying he loved me, without any acknowledgement of the pain his words had caused. I sat in my kitchen holding the phone long after the dial tone had started, trying to process what I had just heard. This was not the little boy I had raised, not the young man I had been so proud of when he graduated college. This was a stranger, a cold, calculating person who had decided that his mother's love and sacrifice meant nothing compared to his own convenience and pleasure. That night, I did something I had not done since Robert's funeral. I got down on my knees beside my bed and prayed, not for healing from my surgery, not for strength to get through my recovery, but for wisdom to understand how I had failed so completely as a mother. I asked God to help me figure out where I had gone wrong, how I had raised a child who could be so cruel and heartless to the person who loved him most. I prayed for hours, crying until I had no tears left, begging for some kind of sign about what I should do next, how I could possibly move forward with this knowledge about who my son really was. The answer to my prayers came in a way I never expected, from a source that would reveal the final, most devastating truth about my son and his wife. The next morning, I received a phone call from my bank, the same bank where I had worked part-time for 10 years after Robert died to supplement our Social Security income. The customer service representative was calling to verify some unusual activity on my account, specifically a large cash advance that had been taken against my credit card 3 months earlier. The amount was $5,000, and according to their records, it had been authorized by someone with access to my account information. Someone who knew my Social Security number, my mother's maiden name, and other personal details that only a family member would know. As I listened to the bank representative explain the details of this transaction, my hands started shaking so badly I could barely hold the phone. 3 months earlier, right around the time Michael had started becoming distant and visiting less often, someone had used my personal information to take a cash advance against my credit card. $5,000 that I had never authorized, never received, never even known about until this moment. The bank was calling because they had flagged it as potential fraud, and they needed to verify whether I had given permission for this transaction. When I told them I had absolutely no knowledge of it, that I would never take a cash advance for that amount of money, they said they would start a fraud investigation immediately. But even as I spoke to the bank representative, even as I gave them all the information they needed to investigate this theft, I already knew in my heart who had done this to me. There was only one person who had access to all my personal information, only one person who knew where I kept my important documents, only one person who could have easily taken my credit card information without me knowing. My own son, the person I trusted more than anyone else in the world, had stolen $5,000 from me. And suddenly, everything else made sense. The expensive Hawaiian vacation, the fancy resort photos, the designer clothes Sarah had been wearing in those Facebook pictures. They had paid for their dream vacation with money stolen from his own mother. The bank representative asked me if I had any idea who might have had access to my personal information, and for a moment I could not speak. How do you tell a stranger that your own child, the person you raised and loved and sacrificed everything for, has robbed you? How do you admit that the son you are so proud of is not just selfish and ungrateful, but actually a criminal? In that moment, sitting in my kitchen 3 weeks after surgery, still weak and in pain, I realized that everything I thought I knew about my life, my family, my son, had been a lie. And the worst part was, I had a feeling this was still not the end of the betrayals I would discover. The bank investigation took 2 weeks, and during those 14 days I felt like I was living in a nightmare that would not end. Every time my phone rang, every time I checked my mail, every time I looked at those Facebook photos of Michael and Sarah enjoying their stolen vacation, I felt sick to my stomach. The bank investigators were thorough and professional, and they quickly confirmed what I already knew in my heart. The $5,000 cash advance had been taken using my personal information, and the only person who had access to all those details was someone very close to me, someone I trusted completely. The investigators asked me directly if I suspected a family member, and when I finally said yes, when I finally spoke my son's name out loud as a suspect in fraud against his own mother, something inside me died forever. But I knew I could not let this go, could not pretend it had not happened, could not continue to be a victim of my own child's greed and selfishness. I had to confront him, had to look him in the eye and demand the truth, even though I was terrified of what that truth might reveal about the man I had raised. So I did something I had never done before in all the years since he had moved out. I drove to his house unannounced, parked in his driveway, walked up to his front door, and rang the doorbell like any other visitor. When Sarah answered the door, the look of surprise and annoyance on her face told me everything I needed to know about how welcome I was in their home, in their perfect little life built on lies and stolen money. Sarah called for Michael, and when he came to the door, he looked irritated and rushed, just like he always did when he had to deal with me. He asked what I was doing there, why I had not called first, whether everything was okay. The irony of him asking if everything was okay, when he was the reason everything was falling apart, was almost too much to bear. I told him we needed to talk, that there was something important we needed to discuss privately. He looked at Sarah, and they exchanged one of those silent married couple conversations that happen with just a glance. Sarah said she was going to run some errands and would be back later, leaving us alone to have the most difficult conversation of my entire life. We sat in his living room, surrounded by all the nice things they had bought with their good jobs and their bright future, and for a moment I felt proud again, remembering how hard I had worked to give him opportunities, to make sure he could have a better life than I had had. But then I remembered why I was there, and that pride turned to ash in my mouth. I pulled out the bank statements, the fraud investigation paperwork, the evidence that someone had stolen from me, and I placed it all on his coffee table between us. I watched his face as he realized what he was looking at, watched the color drain from his cheeks, watched his eyes dart around the room like he was looking for an escape route. For a long moment, neither of us spoke. The silence stretched between us like a canyon, filled with 25 years of love and sacrifice and disappointment and betrayal. Finally, I asked him the question that would change everything between us forever. I asked him if he had taken money from my credit card without my permission, if he had used my personal information to steal $5,000 from his own mother. I asked him if he had paid for his Hawaiian vacation, the vacation he had chosen over my surgery, with money he had stolen from me. And then I waited, hoping against hope that there was some other explanation, some misunderstanding, Some way this could all make sense without my son being a thief. But Michael did not deny it. He did not act surprised or confused or outraged at the accusation. Instead, he got defensive and angry, like I was the one who had done something wrong by discovering his crime. He said that I had more money than I needed, that I was just sitting on savings while he and Sarah were trying to build a life together. He said that he had always planned to pay it back, that it was not really stealing if he was going to replace the money eventually. He said that I should understand that young couples need experiences and memories, that I had had my chance to travel and enjoy life when I was younger. Every word out of his mouth made me feel sicker, made me realize how completely he had justified his betrayal in his own mind. When I asked him how long he had been planning to steal from me, how long he had been lying to my face while plotting to rob his own mother, his answer was even worse than I had imagined. He said that he and Sarah had been talking about taking that Hawaii trip for over a year, but they could not afford it on their salaries. He said that Sarah had suggested using my credit card information, that she had convinced him it was not really stealing because I would never even notice $5,000 missing from my account. They had planned this together, had discussed it and decided together that stealing from me was acceptable, that my money was somehow theirs to take whenever they wanted it. But the most devastating revelation was still coming. When I asked him why he had lied about the work emergency, why he had promised to be there for my surgery when he knew he was going to Hawaii, Michael looked me straight in the eye and said something I will never forgive and will never forget. He said that he had tried to convince Sarah to postpone the trip, that he had initially planned to be there for my surgery. But Sarah had told him that if he canceled their vacation to take care of his needy mother, she would never forgive him. She had given him an ultimatum. Choose the trip with her, or choose staying home to help me recover from surgery. And he had chosen her. My son had chosen his wife's demands over his mother's needs, had chosen a stolen vacation over his mother's well-being, had chosen to lie to my face rather than stand up to Sarah and do the right thing. He admitted that the work emergency had been completely made up, that they had left for the airport while I was in surgery, that they had spent the entire week in Hawaii knowing I was home alone recovering from an operation. He said it like he expected me to understand, like he thought I would appreciate his honesty now that the truth was finally out. But all I could think about was how I had felt waking up alone in that recovery room, how I had waited for him to call, how I had made excuses for him to the nurses and to Mrs. Rodriguez and even to myself. When I asked him about the Facebook posts calling my surgery family drama, about Sarah's comments about how I was too needy, Michael did not even try to defend me or make excuses for his wife. Instead, he agreed with her. He said that since Robert died, I had become too dependent on him, that I expected too much from them as a young married couple, that they needed space to build their own life without constantly worrying about me. He said that my surgery had been perfectly routine, that I had recovered just fine without their help, and that this proved I was more capable of taking care of myself than I pretended to be. The cruelty of his words, the complete lack of empathy or understanding, showed me that this was not my son anymore, not the child I had raised with love and values and compassion. I asked him if he felt any guilt about stealing from me, about lying to me, about abandoning me when I needed him most. His answer was the final nail in the coffin of our relationship. He said that parents exist to help their children succeed, that everything I had was ultimately supposed to be his inheritance anyway, so taking $5,000 early was not really a big deal. He said that I should be happy that the money had gone toward creating happy memories for him and Sarah, that I should want them to enjoy their young married life instead of being burdened with taking care of an aging parent. He actually used the word burdened to describe caring for the woman who had given him everything, who had sacrificed her own dreams and happiness to ensure he had every opportunity in life. In that moment, sitting in his living room listening to him justify theft and abandonment and cruelty, I realized that the little boy I had raised was completely gone. The man sitting across from me was a stranger, someone who had learned to be selfish and entitled and completely without conscience. I had failed as a mother, not because I had not loved him enough or given him enough, but because I had somehow raised a person who believed that love was something he deserved but never had to give back. I had created someone who saw his own mother as nothing more than a resource to be used and then discarded when she was no longer convenient. But then something unexpected happened, something that surprised even me. Instead of crying, instead of begging him to change, instead of trying to convince him that he was wrong, I felt a strange sense of clarity and peace wash over me. I looked around his living room, at all the nice furniture and expensive decorations, and I realized that none of it meant anything if it was bought with stolen money and justified with lies. I looked at my son, at this person I no longer recognized, and I felt sorry for him. Not sorry enough to forgive him, not sorry enough to enable him further, but sorry that he had chosen to become someone so empty and heartless that he could steal from his own mother and feel justified in doing it. I stood up from his couch, gathered my bank statements and fraud paperwork, and told him exactly what I was going to do next. I was going to press full charges for fraud and theft. I was going to cooperate completely with the police investigation. I was going to make sure that he faced the legal consequences of his actions, just like any other criminal would. And most importantly, I was going to remove him from my will, close the joint bank account I had kept open for emergencies, and change all my passwords and personal information so he could never steal from me again. His face went white when he realized I was serious, when he understood that his actions were going to have real consequences that his charm and excuses could not fix. Michael tried to backtrack then, tried to apologize and make promises about paying the money back immediately. He said he had made a mistake, that he loved me, that he would do anything to make this right. But it was too late for apologies, too late for promises, too late for the kind of manipulation that had worked on me for so many years when I was desperate for his love and attention. I told him that love is not just a word you say, it is something you demonstrate with your actions, and his actions had shown me exactly how much I meant to him. I told him that I would always be his mother, that I would always love the little boy he used to be, but that I could no longer have a relationship with the man he had chosen to become. As I walked toward his front door, Michael followed me, pleading and making promises and trying to convince me that this was all a misunderstanding that we could work out as a family. But I was done listening to his lies, done making excuses for his behavior, done sacrificing my own dignity and self-respect for someone who saw me as nothing more than a source of money and free services. I turned around one last time and told him something I should have said years earlier. I told him that being a mother does not mean accepting abuse from your children, that love has to go both ways to mean anything, and that I deserved better from the person I had given my whole life to raising. The months that followed were difficult but also liberating in ways I had not expected. Michael was arrested and charged with credit card fraud and identity theft. The legal process was painful and public and embarrassing, but it was also necessary. He eventually pleaded guilty to avoid a trial, received probation and community service, and was ordered to pay full restitution plus interest and court costs. Sarah filed for divorce within 2 months of his arrest, apparently deciding that being married to a convicted thief was not compatible with the life she had imagined for herself. The irony that she had been the one to suggest stealing from me in the first place was not lost on anyone who knew the real story. But the most important change was in me. For the first time in 25 years, I was living my life for myself instead of for my son. I used the restitution money he was ordered to pay me to take a trip to Ireland, something I had always dreamed of doing but had never been able to afford because every extra dollar had gone to Michael's needs and wants. Mrs. Rodriguez and I became close friends, and her family welcomed me into their lives in a way that felt natural and genuine. I started volunteering at the hospital where I had been treated, helping other elderly patients who were facing surgery alone, making sure no one else had to go through what I had experienced. And if you have stayed with me through this entire story, if you understand the pain of being betrayed by someone you love more than life itself, please take a moment to like this video and subscribe to our channel. Your support helps me share these difficult but important stories with people who need to know they are not alone. The truth is, we cannot control how other people choose to treat us, even our own children, but we can control how we respond. We can choose to maintain our dignity, to protect ourselves from further harm, and to build new relationships with people who appreciate and value us. I learned that being a good mother does not mean accepting abuse, theft, and abandonment from your children. It means loving them enough to hold them accountable for their actions, even when that accountability comes with painful consequences. I learned that family is not just about blood relation, it is about mutual respect and genuine care and being there for each other when it matters most. And I learned that it is never too late to start over, to find new sources of joy and purpose, to surround yourself with people who see your worth and treat you accordingly. My son and I have not spoken since that day in his living room 3 years ago. I do not know if he ever thinks about me, if he ever regrets his choices, if he ever misses the relationship we used to have. But I have made peace with his decision to choose selfishness over love, theft over honesty, abandonment over loyalty. I cannot change who he became, but I could change how I responded to it, and I chose to protect myself and find happiness in other places with other people. The little boy I raised with so much love and hope is gone, but the woman who raised him, who survived his betrayal, who rebuilt her life from the ashes of his cruelty, is stronger than she ever knew she could be. Sometimes the greatest act of love is knowing when to let go, and sometimes the only way to save yourself is to accept that the person you loved most in the world has chosen to become someone you can no longer recognize or trust. But life goes on, and happiness is still possible, and love can be found in the most unexpected places with the most unexpected people. And that, my dear friends, is a lesson worth learning, no matter how painful the teacher might have been.